To some extent, I think the battle here is almost one of statism or collectivism versus individual liberty. Who's going to shape who? So you've got the sort of push from the left, identity politics, victimhood policies, approaches and what have you. We owe these people what have you. So the state has control and shapes individuals and helps them forward. On the other hand, you have the different view that says, no, the state should be shaped by the people who make up the state. You know, Australia is a sum total of individuals who are Australian, and they ought to be shaping the public square, not having the public square, if you like, or the public sector shaping them.
No, the whole argument is about what's the primary unit of analysis. That's everything. What's the primary unit of analysis? And in the West, the primary unit of the analysis has been the logos, and that's something like divine individual consciousness. And it's on that ground that we developed our idea of individual sovereignty and citizenship. And, you know, we don't talk about a citizen as someone who adopts the responsibilities of an ethical being. That's a citizen. We don't talk about that even in schools, and tell people that, look, the meaning in your life is going to be found. It's going to be proportionate to the degree that you take responsibility for positively shaping your experience and the experience of the people around you. And this isn't like be good in some weak, be inoffensive and harmless sense. It's not that at all. It's like, get your spine straight, get your aggression integrated, pick a heavy goal, like a heavy high goal, something you can barely tolerate lifting, and struggle along with it. And that's where you'll find your self-respect. And people know that. It's fun to watch the working class guys respond to this too, you know, because they know this. Most of those guys work like mad, you know, and they know that there's nobility in that, and there is. And so it's well, and people also say, well, that they're happy to come to my lectures or even read the book because I'm helping them find words to express things that they already knew to be true. And those things that they know to be true are the bedrock axioms of our culture. And one of the things we got right in the West was the idea of the sovereign, responsible individual, not the person with rights, and certainly not the person with rights granted to them by the state. That's not part of the English common law tradition. You're the locus of rights, but only in some sense because you're the locus of ultimate responsibility. And I guess part of what I've been trying to tell people is that there's no difference between meaning and responsibility. They're the same thing.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Now, as I looked at that audience, I thought to myself, we're doing a lot of talking about the First World War in this country. 60,000 Australians died out of a very small population in that horrendous event. And we celebrate their bravery, those young Anzacs, we call them, who went off to Gallipoli and then to the Western Front and were involved in some of the critical battles of the First World War. Every year, Australians turn out in extraordinary numbers, and more young Australians turn out to, if you like, pay tribute to their courage. And as I looked out across that audience, I thought there's a lot of people here that I'd willingly, or I would choose to be with in the trenches. They are essentially people who want to be, to use the word you did just a moment ago, noble to the best of their ability. But they live in a culture somehow that says, no, that's all nonsense, that's not where you ought to go. And it seemed to me that they're deeply resenting and deeply keen to reject that approach.
Look, here's what it is. So there's this idea that that's pushed very hard in the universities by the postmodern neo-Marxist types. And before anybody objects, I know perfectly well that technically speaking, postmodernism and neo-Marxism aren't commensurate, but it doesn't stop people from joining them together ideologically. But in any case, the idea is that the West is fundamentally an oppressive patriarchy, which it isn't. It's partly an oppressive society because every society is partly oppressive and flawed, but fundamentally, the West is not an oppressive patriarchy. But if you buy that line, then the next thing that comes along is that anything you do that contributes to that patriarchy is also oppressive and tyrannical. And so that's extraordinarily demoralizing for people who are trying to make their way in the world, because they're trying to hoist their responsibilities up on their shoulders and become competent, contributing adults, and they're criticized to death for being oppressive tyrants. And so there's a conflation of competence with tyranny. And you can't do anything to anyone that's more demoralizing than that. Nietzsche said, if you want to punish someone, punish them for their virtues. And so they're tired of that. It's so demoralizing. Like it appeals to the part of each man, let's say, and each woman for that matter, who wants to avoid responsibility. Because you can rationalize it and say, well, I'm not going to take responsibility because that just makes me a tyrant and an agent of the patriarchy. But that sort of thing leads people down a terrible path. And I've seen that in my friends and in my clinical practice. So instead we say, look, like our culture has problems, every culture does. And it needs everyone has to be awake so that we don't slip at every level of our social being into something like a blind authoritarianism. But the way that happens is by waking up and taking responsibility once again for yourself and your family and your community. And that's noble, which is a word you never hear. It's like a human being has to be a noble creature to withstand the tragedy of existence without becoming corrupt. And so, and that call is to the best in people.
And Jordan, just we should wrap up on that part of it that evening though, but there was one other thing. When we came to question time, there were 4 mics in the room. They were lined up 20 deep at each. We got 7, I think. The 7th question was from a lady who asked a very intelligent question about what parents bring to their children, and in particular, were there things that mothers brought to their children that women do best, and are there things that fathers bring to their children that are best? You gave a very rousing answer. The issue of fathering, and as I say, there are a lot of men there. I gather that your audiences, the demographics have broadened out now, but that was a very young man-centric group. And you hammered the importance, as I heard it, of fathering.
Well, the empirical literature on this is absolutely clear. I mean, we have this idea that's being pushed forward that all families are equal. It's like there's a grain of truth in that people who are struggling mightily to raise their children properly are worthy of respect, whether they're single or in couples. But the empirical literature is absolutely clear that stable, intact families with fathers there produce children who do way better on almost every possible measure. And even more than that in communities where fathers tend to be at home with, as part of the stable family, the communities themselves do better, even those kids that don't have fathers at home. So the role of father is unbelievably important. And the question is, what particular role does a father play? And I just had a good conversation with Warren Farrell about that. And part of my research had indicated that men are particularly useful in initiating rough and tumble play and play with their children in general. And Farrell extended that by noting that men could use the opportunity to play as a reward for delaying gratification among their children. And that's a really big deal, because one of the things you have to do to help people mature is to teach them to delay gratification and to sustain attention. And it looks like men, the pleasure that children get in playing with their fathers, rough and tumble play, but other forms of play as well, a form of primary reward that can be used to help children learn to make the proper sacrifices and regulate their impulses over the long term. So and I think fathers, now of course mothers can do this too, but I think fathers because mothers are generally charged with the fundamental care, say, of infants, there's a tension between that and encouraging children to step forward out into the world as courageous beings. And mothers are very, very attached to their infants, and their infants are very fragile. And it's often hard for them to make the transition from primary security provider and caregiver to forthright encourager of adventure. And that's certainly something that fathers can do. It's better to construe life as an adventure rather than as an enterprise that's there to make you feel secure or happy. It's a great adventure, and a dangerous one at that, because everyone's life is at stake in this adventure. We're unbelievably tough creatures if we put ourselves out fully.
Okay, now you said something very interesting there and very important in my view. You talked about empirical evidence in relation to the importance of fathering. Empirical evidence, reason, evidence-based decision-making, calm, thoughtful deliberation rather than emotion, In other words, the difference between thinking and feeling seems to me to be incredibly important. We should follow the facts to where they take us. But we're confronted by, it seems to be, you mentioned and you said they're not related, but we tie them together, cultural Marxism and postmodernism. It seems to me the cultural Marxist will deliberately distort the truth because of their agendas, or hide the truth because of their agendas. The postmodernists have fallen into this trap of, if you like, moral relativity. So what's good for you is true for you, and what's good for me is true for me, even if they're really painting black as white and white as black. Isn't that a problem?
It's worse than that in some sense, because it's not even what's true for you is true for you and what's true for me is true for me. It's what's true for your group is only good for your group, and what's true for my group is only good for my group. And so that sets us off in group conflict in a tribal sort of way. You know, the real radical types who are swallowed up by this ideology believe that science itself is nothing but a Eurocentric patriarchal construct. I mean, they dispense completely with the fact that scientific discovery has given us this incredible technological power that's lifted the entire world out of abject poverty in a period of about 150 years. For them, for some reason, that doesn't constitute evidence. And so when you bring up evidence, there's hand waving, because the people who dispute this sort of thing rarely know the details of the literature. They just write it off and say, well, that whole scientific enterprise, that's just part of the way that Eurocentric males dominate and destroy the planet. It's all power games for these people. There's no reality at the bottom of it outside of the power game. And so that's a viewpoint that leads inevitably to tribal conflict.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.